chassid that goes to the Tzemach Tzedek, right? The chassid, no, it doesn't go to the Tzemach Tzedek, pardon me. There's a chassid who stole from another chassid. He stole money from him. So the chassid, the other guy comes to him and he says, give me it back. Or maybe it was a loan. I maybe misremembering the beginning of the story. But he says, give me my money back, whatever the case is. And the guy says, you never loaned me money because Einad Milvade, right? The money is God. I'm God. You're God. Everything's God, right? There's mine
is yours.
Yeah, mine is yours. Yours is mine. Everything. The whole thing never existed in the first place. Everything is just God. So the chassid takes this guy, this Meshugana, to the Rebbe the Tzemach Tzedek. And he says in front of the Rebbe the Tzemach Tzedek, he must have really been a Meshugana, because to say it in front of the Rebbe is a whole other thing. But he said the same story. Money is God, I'm God, you're God. The whole thing never happened. So the Tzemach Tzedek said, okay, well, we're going to take this piece of godliness, and we're going to bend it over this piece of godliness, we're going to hit it with this piece of godliness, and we're going to find out if everything's really God. In other words, easy to say. Let's see how consistent you are. That's the... Let's see if you really believe it, you know. Anyway, where was I? Yes. So you have the higher level unity and the lower level unity, right? Is the theme of this whole book. The crux, the turning point, the hinge of this whole book is the wrong button. There we go. The hinge of this whole book is the higher unity, the lower unity. Yichud Elah, Yichud Tata, right? And a higher way. The lower way says, as we summarized on the other side, right? The lower way says that there is a world, but that world is nothing other than godliness. The higher way says, what is the world? It's just an expression of God. There isn't really a world at all. Or really, it's even better summarized as God expresses himself everywhere and in every way, right? And the world is just part of that expression. That's the higher level unity, right? But either way, for our purposes, coming out of chapters 3 through 6, either unity says that the world, the fact that God is coming down to speak the cup into existence, that the real secret is, right, as we said when we learned chapter 7, that chapters 1 through 6 are really just an introduction to the real thing the Alter Rebbe wants to say, which is that this whole fact that God comes and creates this thing, that itself is not really real. Really, God's creation of this thing is just a further expression of him exactly as he was before the 6 days of creation. Even when we talk about the godly source of this thing, the words that are creating it, that itself is absolutely one with God, and there has never been any change. There has never been any difference made by this action. So is creating the cup important? The answer is how can it be important? I'm not sure if it ever really happened, right? The whole thing from the beginning, God's trait of kingship is absolutely one with him. And God didn't change, right? Then the question becomes like this, and this is the question for the whole last column here, which begins halfway through chapter 7, right, and goes through the end of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah. The question is, so how can he be here then? In other words, chapters 1 through 6 were explaining how, really, what is the reality of everything? It's godliness. The first half of chapter 7 comes and tells you the shocking truth, which is that really all there really is God. He never even, this whole process of speaking the world into existence is, from his perspective, the whole thing never even really occurs. It's just him existing. So the question becomes, so then how can he be present within all of these things? How is this whole perception that he does create, and there's a whole system, and he comes down and he creates it, and he creates all there, there's multiplicity, there's 10 different spheres, and then those spheres produce the divine speech, and the divine speech produces the creation. How can he be within that whole process, right? Haven't we just concluded that whole process is essentially, in a deep sense, is illusory, is not real, right? It's an illusion. That whole process apparently never really took place. So what are we supposed to conclude? We're just supposed to conclude, apparently, that this is of no importance.
No, there's even a bigger problem.
We don't even perceive it as being really real. And in fact, our perspective and God's perspective on this matter are totally different, right? God doesn't see this whole thing as being really important, and we see it as the inextricable from our very existence, right? We need it to exist, right? And essentially what you've created is you've created this interesting distance. In the very process of explaining that everything is godly, you have created a distance between God and not the world, but our perception of the world and the way that the world appears to be. To answer this, you have the second half of chapter 7 through the end of chapter 12. The Alter Rebbe comes and he is explaining that God, exactly as he is, that same God who never changes, that same God who is beyond descending into the creation, and that whole thing from his perspective never takes place, that very God is within the creation, is within every level of the process, and is even within the result, is even within the creation, the cup as we perceive it. God is in that place exactly as he is. Say that God is absolutely simple, which is what we discussed in chapter. We say the theme of the second half of the second part of Tanya is that God is absolutely simple and he has no parts, right? What do we mean by that? What do we mean by that? We mean that that means, I'm repeating myself. We mean that this whole process of his self-concealment and the creation and all of these different steps is not a contradiction to God as he is absolutely one. On the contrary, because he is absolutely simple, he is able to be present and within every single step of this process, right? That sounds very abstract, but we've learned this already. How does this work? So we say in chapter 7, top of the third column, we say, first of all, God's knowledge is one with him, right? He has a knowledge. That knowledge and him are absolutely one. How do we explain that? Or what does that help us explain? It goes both ways. The non-literal tzimtzum, right? Tzimtzum eno kapshutai. Tzimtzum shaloi kapshutai. The tzimtzum is not a literal removal of God from our reality. It is simply the fact that God creates a perception that he creates a perspective that cannot see that he is here. That's all the tzimtzum is. When God removes himself from our reality, right? When he hollows out an empty place to allow the Seder Hishtalshalus and all of reality to occur, right? All the worlds and all the spheres and all of these different things. What is he really doing? He is simply allowing a perspective to arise that does not see that nothing has changed, right? In other words, a different way of saying this is, God is present right here, just like he was before he created anything. Right? Before we were saying, right, when with the first half of chapter 7, summarizing or concluding chapters 1 through 6, before we were saying that there's two opposite ideas. Either the world takes it, or you see nothing has changed, right? The second half of chapter 7 and the rest of Shaar HaYichud, not an either or, it's a both. Right? It's not an either or. It's not an either God does speak the cup into existence or God hasn't changed since before the creation. It's both. He both has never changed and he is speaking the cup into existence. And it's not a contradiction. Now, the way it's not a contradiction may not be understandable by the human intellect. But the point is that it's not a contradiction. Both of these things are true. That's what the Alter Rebbe is saying in the second half of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah. Right? That we conclude that everything, nothing is anything, that nothing exists apart from God. We conclude through chapters 1 through 6. First half of chapter 7, we say, really, even the words that God is speaking from his perspective, that never happened. It's aniyava elo shanisi. It's just God. All he sees is the extension of his infinite self. That's all he sees. Right? From his perspective, that's all that's happening here. Right? We could say that this whole thing is really not real. God has one view on the matter, and for some reason we have been given a different view on the matter, and our view is not real and his view is real, right? And really nothing has really ever changed. The whole back part of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, the whole part from the second half of chapter 7 through to chapter 12 is telling you it's not an either or, it's a both.
Both real.
Both are real. God both speaks the world into existence and is present within that constantly, and he has never changed and is absolutely simple. Right? So that's why chapters 8 and 9 begin to speak about how God is infinitely beyond even his own wisdom. Right? We had that whole fun discussion for a few weeks. That God is not just beyond human understanding, God is beyond all understanding. And then we say, but doesn't the Torah call God wise? Right? That's our question, chapter 8 and chapter 9. Then we go on to explain, it's because wisdom is emanated, it's not created, right? Why is God called wise? Not just because he's the source of wisdom, right? Remember, because otherwise we'd ask, why is God not called the source of elephants, right? He's called wise, not the source of elephants, even though both wisdom and elephants come from him, right? Because the difference between wisdom and elephants is that wisdom is right? It's the world of Atzilus. It's the emanated reality, which is what? Which is the source in a different place, right? His wisdom is actually an expression of him in the way that an elephant is not. And then we say that God's traits are all absolutely one with him, right? They're absolutely one with him in a way that is totally incomprehensible. God's wisdom, on the one hand, right, in chapters 8 and 9, the Alter Rebbe is explicitly saying both are true, right? That's where you actually see the Alter Rebbe say this. He's saying God comes down to emanate wisdom. His wisdom is an expression of him in a different place. On the other hand, God is infinitely removed from wisdom and cannot express himself, and cannot be expressed in wisdom at all, right? And in chapters 8 and 9, the Alter Rebbe is saying both are true. Both are true. On the one hand, God cannot be expressed in wisdom at all. On the other hand, his wisdom expresses him. This is totally impossible to understand, which is why God's traits are called the Raza de Mehem Nusa, the secret of faith. Right? They are faith things. They are not comprehensible things. In chapter 10, we attempt, even though we've just said that this cannot be understood, in chapter 10, we actually attempt to understand it a little bit, which is a very intriguing approach, and we commented on it at the time, right? The Alter Rebbe says that we try understand through negative understanding, or whatever the explanation was, with the second metaphor of the ray of the sun in the sun, where we say that not that the ray does not exist in the sun, but on the contrary, the ray and the sun are actually one thing, right? That in chapter 3, we said the ray of the sun in the sun means there's no ray, there's only sun. In chapter 10, we're saying, what is the ray? The ray is sun. The sun and the ray are the same thing within the sun. Can't get into that now. But so God contracts himself, and then we conclude, God contracts himself into 10 different middos, into 10 different traits, right, or 11, however you want to count them, right, wisdom, kindness, knowledge, etc. The differences between them are really only from the perspective of the creation, right? It's only from a difference between any of these traits. From God's perspective, they're all absolutely one with him. Again, not a contradiction, right? You have the 10 different traits, which God is constantly creating as different, right? From his das tachton, from his lower perspective. But from his higher perspective, all of those 10 things are really just absolutely one. In chapter 11, we say that this is not just true of his traits, it's true even of the divine speech, right? We're coming back down into all the levels we spoke about earlier. It's true not just of the divine traits, but of the divine... So chapter 10 really corresponds to chapter 7, because chapter 7 talked about the spheres, chapter 10 talks about the spheres. Chapter 11 is going back down now to like chapters 1 through 3, where we're talking about the divine speech, right? The divine speech, the different words that God says are absolutely one with him, just like the different traits are. And then in chapter 12, we say not just the words, but even the exchanges and the switches of the letters as they're brought down to actually create and become the soul of the creation. Even those letters, even that lowest expression that actually becomes the creation, even that is absolutely right. So a different way of saying this is that chapters 8 and 12 are really just expanding on the idea of tzimtzum like pshutai. They're really just expanding on this idea and trying to grapple with this idea that God's infinite presence is here even now. From his perspective, there is no difference. Everything is just full of his infinite presence. How is that possible? Well, his chachma is absolutely one with his infinite presence, and his malchus is one with his infinite presence, and the speech that comes from malchus is one with his infinite presence, and the creation that comes from the speech is one with his infinite presence. So therefore, we see what that means. Tzimtzum lo kapshuta. The only difference is that he is creating a perspective, the perspective of the creation, which does not perceive this unity, even though that unity is present at every level. And as we in fact said at the end of chapter 12, you can even see it within the creation, even though you can't perceive it directly. We explained that the very fact that the creation is a function of only 22 letters, right, is something that we even see in the creation, that the creation has fewer general principles that govern all of the multiplicity and all the differences that we see in the creation. That is how you can even see God's unity at the level of the creation itself. So that's Shaar HaYichud. You see the pyramid, chapters 1 through 6, then chapter 7 at the top, which is the one to go from the top back down, and then chapters 8 to 12 come back down. Now, all of that having been said, I'll just conclude with this very quickly, right? We see now why we need the structure that the Alter Rebbe gave to the book, why the Alter Rebbe teaches the book in this way, that it has this pyramid structure and it goes up and then down, right? Why? Because if you only have chapters 1 through 6, right? If when someone tells you that God is absolutely one and the universe is nothing other than God, right? If you only have chapters 1 through 6, it's possible to think that in the end, the creation, as I said before, the creation still has importance and is still relevant to God. That something, in fact, is actually still being created here. The creation is not real on its own terms, but on God's terms, God is constantly creating it, and so the creation is really real, right? There is still something to this cup that has to be reckoned with, not because I think it's a cup, because God is constantly saying cost to create it, right? If I only had chapters 1 through 6, that's what I would think, which is why there's a second half to this. Because in chapter 7, the Alter Rebbe comes and he says, even God speaking the thing into existence, what is it really? It's absolutely one with God. None of these things have their own reality or importance at all, right? So to achieve that ultimate sense of bittul, that ultimate departure from the animal way of understanding the world, you need chapter 7 as well, and the rest of the Shaar HaYichud, which is, as I said, explaining chapter 7. Right? On the other hand, so you could say, well, why don't we just have chapters 8 through 12 then? Right? If chapters 8 through 12 are talking about the way in which everything is absolutely, makes no difference to God's unity, and Ani Avayalei Shanisi, I God have not changed at all, then we should just have those chapters and not have the first 6. Right? Why not? You can figure out the answer yourself. It's not so hard.
It's clear. He wouldn't create us if this is what he wanted. He created for us to see what he does in 1 to 6.
Right, exactly. Or a different way of saying it is that we would only understand the way everything is 7 through 12, let's say. We would only understand how everything is nothing on God's terms, but not on the terms on our terms or the terms of the creation itself. In other words, it wouldn't be complete. You would say, okay, everything is nothing, but ultimately I don't see how that actually reaches the physical, tangible reality in which I live, right? Chapters 1 through 6 is essentially breaking you out, step by step, intellectually from this box where you think that everything has to be exactly as it looks, essentially, right? That God is not constantly involved, that these things have their own realities, their own natures, which are set and firm and they're real, right? Chapters 1 through 6 breaks you out of that illusion, right? So that you can appreciate this higher perspective on the divine unity, the lower unity, the higher unity, the way in which God doesn't change, and yet He is still united with the reality. And in fact, in chapter 7, you really see in chapter 7 the unity between the two approaches, right? Chapters 8 through 12 are that God is absolutely one, and I, God, haven't changed. Chapters 1 through 6 are saying that the universe is nothing other than godliness. In chapter 7, these two ideas are really one idea, right? Why is the universe nothing other than godliness? Because God's trait of kingship, one of His 10 traits, is absolutely one with Him, right? God's trait of kingship is absolutely one with him. Therefore, the universe is absolutely nothing. So in that sentence, you get both halves of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah, right? God's trait of kingship is never really a departure from him. Tzimtzum lo kapshutai, a non-literal tzimtzum. I, God, haven't changed. His kingship is not a departure from what God is before he begins to create. It's simply an extension of what God is before he begins to create. It's just God. That's all that's really here. Therefore, I go back and read chapters 1 through 6, and I can say, oh, that's why everything is nothing other than God, right? That's why...
I have a big problem there.
Why?
I perfectly understand what you're saying, but I feel like not really like, complete. Because how can God not see things that we... The cup is here.
Right.
And the cup was not here like 2 seconds ago, and now it's here.
Right.
So there is a change or there's no change?
Right.
For our
both.
Eyes, no, I understand.
Yeah.
But for our eyes, there is change.
Yeah.
So if God would have looked at that cup...
No, he does. He does look at it through our eyes. That's the whole point. That's the whole point of chapters 8 through 12. God is creating the perspective of our eyes at every moment. That's what chapter 8 through 12 is saying.
I want to give an example.
Yeah.
It really depends on the sensor that you're looking at things.
Right.
Imagine there's a mountain.
Yeah.
Now you take like 1,000 people, they move the mountain from one place to another.
Okay.
So if you look at the weight of the whole globe, nothing changed, the same weight.
Right.
Yet, if you look through your eyes, you'll see the difference.
Right.
So, how does God look at things which is different than the way we look at things? Because we understand that nothing changed.
Right.
For God, from the perspective of God. But in our perspective, it did change.
Right. But the truth is that things changed in God's perspective even more than they did in ours, right? Because God's perception is always more real and more perceptive than ours. In other words, God actually has our problems, so to speak, more than we. When God says there's a perspective where things change, that really means something, right? When we think it, who knows? It could be an illusion, it could be not real. When God says there's a perspective from which things have changed, that's firm, right? Chapters 8 through 12, right? 7 through 12, really. Chapters 7 through 12 are all about that. That's essentially what it is. When we say the non-literal tzimtzum, that's exactly what we're saying. We're saying that even though he doesn't go anywhere, he has created a perspective, right? The human, what we would call in that example, the human perspective, even though it's not human, it's God's perspective, right? At that point, at the point of the tzimtzum, no humans exist yet, no world exists yet. It's all just God, right? God creates a perspective from which he sees, right? Apart from the perspective which is infinitely filling all of reality, right? And the whole point of chapters 7 through 12 is that these two perspectives can and do coexist. These two perspectives are simultaneously real, which the human mind cannot understand.
Right. In the eyes of God.
Yeah, in the eyes of... Exactly. These two things are two divine realities, and these realities are equally real divine realities. There's divine reality where the world is being created. God is constantly speaking this cup into existence. And simultaneously, what is this act of constantly speaking the cup into existence? It is the eternal reality of God that has existed since before anything was created, before there was even a tzimtzum. Right? It's the exact same thing. That's the theme of chapters 8 through 12. And the chapter 7 is the point of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah. In other words, if you don't appreciate this crazy idea of the Yichud Elah, Yichud Tata, this idea that nothing has really changed, right? Then you've missed the whole point. Chapters 1 through 6 is to... First, it breaks you free of that perspective, and then, when you go and learn them again, you bring that higher perspective. That's also what's happening in chapters 8 through 12. You're bringing that higher perspective into what you've learned before at every level, right? This is Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah. This is the gate of unity and faith, right? The gate of unity and faith says either a thing is nothing, or it is an expression of God himself. There are no other options. That's the conclusion. That's the grand conclusion of Shaar HaYichud ve'emunah. There's only two options. Either something is not, or those are the only two options.
And they're the same at the end.
What? And in the end, the perception of nothing is itself also godly. Right? Absolutely.
Yeah,
that's exactly
means something totally different.
What means something totally different?
Godly.
What do you mean?
Well, we're in a physical world.
Yeah.
So that...
Yeah, I know.
No, I'm just
That
saying
is. Stop interrupting.
we're in the physical world, which is very different than how God perceives things. Absolutely.
But we have to do physical things because there's no other way of doing it.
Absolutely. So you're saying, so how can we go from this discussion to living how do you live a life with this as the reality of the life? I'm so glad you asked, because that's what all the Maimarim we're going to learn starting next week talk about. If this is true, let's take a far-fetched idea that a person actually believes this is true, right? And you arrive at a fundamental decision that everything in its book is true, right? How then shall we live, as the famous question goes? How then should this impact our life? That's what all of the
how
Maimarim...
doesn't come into it.
What?
The how doesn't come into it.
Why not?
Because the whole thing then becomes why.
Well, yeah, both. I agree. Why and
Why is
how?
more
I have a
powerful
better
than...
conclusion.
I agree.
Why even studying at all?
Both.
After you study, you still get nothing.
Sort of,
Absolutely.
well, there is a...
You start with nothing and you end with nothing.
Yeah, well, you are nothing, so, right?
So
That's
do nothing and that's it.
So do nothing, exactly. Very good point. Why don't we just do nothing
Yes.
then, right?
Because nothing
We
was
do
nothing.
nothing.
What? Well, why don't we just do nothing in the way the world understands
That's what we
nothing?
do, right? We do nothing.
First of all, actually doing nothing, as Ronnie is saying, is actually a very, very difficult thing to do. You know, what is if someone asks
Look at Ronnie,
if someone
come on.
That's nothing. That's nothing.
if someone asks what does doing
Nothing
nothing look
calories.
like, the answer is
Nothing.
doing nothing looks like the Akedah. That's what doing nothing looks like. The first time in history someone did nothing, it was when Avraham went and he bound Yitzchak on the altar, right? How are those two things? I don't know. Hopefully, one of our Maimarim will discuss one of these things.
Doing nothing.
Was doing nothing.
Something.
What? No, he wanted to do nothing.
What do you mean you wanted to do nothing?
The first time a human being achieved a state of true non-existence before God,
Yeah,
well,
but he
doing
wanted
nothing.
to-
He was doing nothing.
No, but he wanted to do it in order to prove that there's nothing.
No, he was doing something by
to prove,
all sorts
he
of.
didn't want to try
He
to
was
just-
doing something by all sorts of worldly terms. He was climbing a mountain and getting a knife and wrapping with rope. In all worldly terms, he was doing something. But that's the thing: is that doing nothing is not defined in worldly terms in Judaism. If you come out of this book believing what this book says and knowing what this book says, right, you realize that doing nothing does not mean being motionless in a physical sense. What difference does that? God creates me when I move from nothing at every moment, right? The same way he creates me when I sit still from nothing at every moment. So what does being nothing mean? It means returning the apparent separation of the world from God back to the state that it was before God created it, to this truth, to the truth of what it says in Shaar HaYichud chapter 7. This thing is just God himself. You have to open a window. You have to make the reality transparent, which can sometimes look like a lot of motion, not like sitting still.
No, so you have to do
You
a
have to
lot
be very
do
busy
nothing.
to do nothing.
Right. That's
You have to. It's very complicated
But
to
you
be
can
simple,
do
and you have to do a lot of things to be nothing.
You can do nothing.
What do you mean?
No, in order for you to do nothing, you need to do a lot. That's
No, you can do nothing.
no, you
But
cannot.
the other things around you that happen